The transport ship landed on Karath Prime just as the twin suns began to set. Hannah Cole stepped off the ramp and felt the heavy, wet air hit her face like a warm blanket. She had read about the climate in her briefing documents, but reading about it and feeling it were two very different things. She was the first human to be stationed here permanently. The Verithan had only signed their peace agreement with the Galactic Union 8 months ago, and trust between the species was still fragile. Hannah's job was simple: provide medical assistance and help build cultural bridges. She was a doctor, a diplomat, and according to some back on Earth, completely out of her mind for taking this assignment. The Verithan were predators, not the kind of predators that humans like to pretend they were, with their grocery stores and climate-controlled homes. The Verithan were the real thing. They stood 8 feet tall on average, covered in scales that shifted between gray and brown depending on their mood. Their faces were somewhere between a cat and a lizard, with forward-facing eyes that could track movement in complete darkness. Their claws could cut through metal. Their teeth were made for tearing, and Hannah was supposed to live among them. A Verithan official met her at the landing pad. His name was Goran, and he served as the outpost's administrative coordinator. He looked at Hannah the way a person might look at a small insect that had wandered into their home. Not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of puzzled indifference. "You are the human doctor," Goran said. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. "I am," Hannah replied. She kept her voice calm and steady. The briefings had been very clear about this. Never show fear, never show aggression, and for the love of everything holy, never smile with teeth showing. Goran led her through the outpost. It was built into the side of a mountain, with corridors carved from dark stone and lit by glowing panels set into the walls. Everything was too big for her. The doorways were designed for beings much taller than her 5'6" frame. The steps were spaced for longer legs. Even the air vents were positioned higher than she could reach. She would adapt. She always did. Her quarters were in the Eastern Medical Wing, a small room that had clearly been modified for human use. The bed was the right size. The temperature controls had been adjusted. Someone had even installed a human-standard shower unit. "You will remain in this area unless escorted," Goran told her. "The warriors do not wish to be disturbed by your presence." Hannah nodded. She understood. She was an outsider, a strange creature from a strange world. It would take time to earn their acceptance. The first few weeks passed slowly. Hannah spent most of her time organizing her medical supplies, studying Verithan anatomy from the files she had brought, and trying not to feel completely isolated. The adult Verithan avoided her. When she walked the corridors, they would step aside and wait for her to pass, watching her with those golden eyes that never seemed to blink. She ate alone. She worked alone. She slept alone. But she was not as alone as she thought. It started with sounds. Soft clicks and scratches outside her door. The whisper of claws on stone. Hannah would look up from her work and see nothing, but she knew something was there. The first time she actually saw them, she almost screamed. 3 Verithan cubs were crouched in her doorway, staring at her with huge, curious eyes. They were small by Verithan standards, which meant they were still about the size of large dogs. Their scales were softer than the adults, more flexible, with a slight shimmer to them. Their claws were already fully developed, long and curved and sharp enough to do serious damage. Hannah froze. The cubs froze. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then one of the cubs sneezed, and they all fled down the corridor so fast that Hannah barely saw them go. She sat very still for a long time after that, her heart pounding in her chest. The cubs came back the next day, and the day after that. They never entered her room, but they watched from the doorway, their ears twitching and their tails curling behind them. Hannah pretended not to notice them. The cultural briefings had warned her about this. Direct acknowledgement could be seen as a challenge, or worse, an invitation to prove dominance. So she went about her work, organizing supplies and running diagnostics, while 3 small predators watched her every move. The largest of the 3 was a male. His scales were darker than the others, and he carried himself with a kind of aggressive confidence that reminded Hannah of teenage boys back on Earth. The smallest was a female, lighter in color, with ears that seemed too big for her head. The third was quiet, always hanging back, always watching with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Hannah learned their names by accident. She overheard an adult Verithan calling for them one evening, her voice sharp with irritation. Torek, Kess, Shen. The cubs scrambled away from Hannah's doorway and disappeared into the depths of the outpost. Days turned into weeks. The cubs became bolder. They crept closer to her door, peering around the frame with obvious curiosity. Hannah continued to pretend she did not see them, even when Kess, the smallest one, made soft chirping sounds that might have been questions. Then came the day that changed everything. It was late afternoon, and the air was particularly humid. Hannah had been working for hours, cataloging medical samples that had arrived on the latest supply ship. Her hair was bothering her. It kept falling into her face, sticking to her neck, getting in the way. Without thinking about it, she reached up and gathered her hair in her hands. She twisted it into a simple knot and secured it with the elastic band she always kept around her wrist. It was such a simple thing, such a small, ordinary thing. She did not know that 3 pairs of eyes were watching from the doorway. She did not see Torek's jaw drop open. She did not hear Kess make a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a squeak. She did not notice Shen lean forward so far that he nearly fell over. To Hannah, she had just tied her hair back, a thing she did 10 times a day without thinking. To the cubs, she had just done something impossible. The Verithan did not manipulate their scales. They did not reshape their bodies. Their appearance was fixed, unchangeable, as much a part of their identity as their names. The idea of taking a piece of yourself and bending it, twisting it, binding it into a new shape was simply not something that existed in their understanding of the world. And yet this small, soft, strange creature had just done exactly that. The cubs fled before Hannah turned around. They ran through the corridors of the outpost, their claws clicking against the stone floor, their minds racing with what they had witnessed. That night, huddled together in their den, they made a decision. They would learn this magic. They would understand this power. And they would bring the strange creature gifts, as was proper when approaching a being of great skill. The only question was, what gifts would such a creature want? The first gift appeared 3 days after the hair incident. Hannah found it on her workstation when she returned from her morning meal. It was a strip of cured hide, about the length of her forearm and the width of 2 fingers. The leather was dark brown, still warm, and it had been placed directly in the center of her desk with obvious care. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. It was well made, smooth on one side, slightly rough on the other. She had no idea where it had come from or why it was there. Her first thought was that it might be a threat. The briefings had mentioned that Verithan warriors sometimes left trophies from their kills as warnings. But something about this felt different. The strip was clean, carefully cut, deliberately placed. It did not feel like a warning. It felt like a gift. Hannah set the strip aside and tried to focus on her work. But her mind kept returning to it. Who had left it? Why? What was she supposed to do with it? The next morning there were 2 strips, then 3. Then a small pile that grew larger with each passing day. She mentioned it to Commander Voss during their weekly communication. He was the human liaison officer stationed on the orbital platform above Karath Prime, and he served as her only regular contact with other humans. Could be nothing, Voss said, his face flickering slightly on the holographic display. Could be something. The Verithan are strange. Their customs are strange. I would be careful if I were you. What do you think I should do? Hannah asked. Voss shrugged. Document everything. Do not throw anything away, and maybe try to figure out who is leaving these things. That night, Hannah made a plan. She finished her work early and dimmed the lights in her quarters. She arranged herself on her examination table, pulling a thin blanket over her body and closing her eyes. She slowed her breathing, made her body relaxed, and waited. An hour passed. Then 2. Hannah's back began to ache from the hard surface, and she had to resist the urge to shift position. The room was dark and quiet, and several times she nearly fell asleep for real. Then she heard it. The soft click of claws on the stone floor outside her door. Hannah kept her breathing slow and even. She opened her eyes just a tiny crack, enough to see but not enough to be noticed. Three shapes crept into the room. The cubs moved with exaggerated care, placing each foot slowly and silently. Torek was in the lead, carrying something in his jaws. He walked to the workstation and carefully placed a strip of hide on the growing pile, then stepped back with an expression of obvious pride. Behind him, Kess held something different. It was thin and shiny, catching the dim light as she moved. Hannah realized with a start that it was a length of copper wire, clearly taken from somewhere it was not supposed to be taken from. The little female added it to the collection with a soft, satisfied sound. Shen came last. He carried nothing. Instead, he simply sat and stared at Hannah, his eyes fixed on the loose hair spread across the pillow beneath her head. His tail curled and uncurled slowly, and Hannah could almost see the thoughts moving behind his golden eyes. The three cubs stood in silence for a long moment, looking at their offerings. Then Torek made a gesture with his head, and they began to creep back toward the door. Hannah wanted to speak. She wanted to sit up and thank them, to ask them what they wanted, to understand why they had chosen her as the target of their strange attention. But she knew that would be wrong. She was not supposed to have seen this. She was supposed to be asleep. So she kept her eyes mostly closed and her breathing slow until the cubs had gone. Only then did she allow herself to sit up. She looked at the pile of gifts on her workstation. Strips of hide, lengths of wire, scraps of fabric in different colors, materials that could be bent and twisted and shaped. And suddenly, Hannah understood. They had seen her tie her hair. They had watched her take something soft and loose and turn it into something fixed and controlled. And now they were bringing her materials, hoping to see her do it again. They wanted to learn. Hannah laughed. It started as a small sound and grew until tears were running down her face. She laughed until her stomach hurt, until she had to sit down on the floor because her legs would not hold her. All this time, she had thought she was alone. She had thought the Verithan had no interest in her, that she was just a strange creature to be tolerated until her assignment ended. But three small predators had looked at her and seen something worth understanding. The next morning, Hannah made a decision. She would teach them. It took her 3 days to figure out how to do it without breaking any cultural rules. She could not approach the cubs directly. She could not invite them to interact with her. Any sign of aggression or dominance would destroy whatever fragile connection they had built. But she could be present. She could be available. She could leave the door open and wait. On the 4th day, she moved her workstation closer to the door. She sat where she could be easily seen from the corridor. She spread out the gifts the cubs had brought, arranging them in neat rows on the surface of her desk. Then she reached up and began to play with her hair. She twisted it slowly, deliberately, making sure each motion was visible. She braided it loosely, then undid the braid. She gathered it into a knot, then let it fall. She repeated these actions again and again, never looking directly at the doorway. She knew they were watching. She could hear the soft sounds of their breathing, could feel the weight of their attention. But she did not look up. She did not acknowledge them. On the 2nd day of this, Kess took a step into the room. It was a single step, nothing more. The little female froze immediately afterward, her body pressed low to the ground, her ears flat against her skull. She watched Hannah with wide, uncertain eyes. Hannah did not look at her. She simply picked up a strip of leather and began to braid it, her fingers moving in the same pattern she used on her hair. Kess made a soft sound. It might have been a question. Hannah continued her work. She finished the braid, tied off the end with a piece of wire, and set it down on the desk. Then she picked up another strip and started again. On the 3rd day, all 3 cubs were inside the room. They still kept their distance. They crouched near the door, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But they watched every movement of Hannah's hands with absolute focus. Hannah knew she was walking a dangerous path. Verithan society had strict rules about who could interact with cubs and under what circumstances. If she pushed too hard, if she moved too fast, she could destroy everything. So she took it slow. She worked on her braids and knots without speaking, without looking, without acknowledging the small predators who watched her with such hunger in their eyes. And slowly, day by day, they crept closer. Torek was the bravest. always pushing forward while the others hung back. Kes was the most curious, her head tilting from side to side as she tried to understand what Hannah's fingers were doing. Shen was the most patient, content to watch and wait and think. On the seventh day, Hannah spoke for the first time. "This is called a braid," she said softly, not looking up from her work. "You take 3 pieces and weave them together. Over, under, over, under." The cubs froze. They looked at each other with wide eyes. Then they looked back at Hannah. She continued working, her voice calm and steady. "It keeps things together. It makes them strong." Kes made a sound that was almost like a word. It might have been strong in her own language, or it might have been something else entirely. Hannah did not know, but for the first time since she had arrived on Karath Prime, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 2 weeks had passed since Hannah first spoke to the cubs. In that time, everything had changed. The cubs no longer hid in the doorway. They came into her room openly now, settling onto the floor in a loose circle around her workstation. They brought gifts every day, sometimes several times a day, piling strips of hide and lengths of wire and scraps of fabric until Hannah's desk could barely hold it all. But more importantly, they were learning. Hannah had started with simple things. She showed them how to twist 2 pieces of cord together to make a stronger rope. She taught them basic knots that would hold fast under pressure. She demonstrated the difference between a braid with 3 strands and a braid with 4. The cubs struggled at first. Their claws were designed for tearing, not for delicate manipulation. Torek ripped 3 strips of leather before he managed to complete a simple twist. Shen spent an entire afternoon trying to tie a knot that kept slipping apart. Kes, the smallest, broke down in frustration after her 5th failed attempt, making a high-pitched whining sound that Hannah had never heard before. But they did not give up. They came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. They practiced until their claws ached. They practiced until the light faded and they could barely see. They practiced with a determination that Hannah found almost frightening in its intensity. And slowly, they began to succeed. Torek finished his first complete braid on the 9th day. It was rough and uneven, with strands that stuck out at odd angles, but it was undeniably a braid. He held it up and made a sound that Hannah was learning to recognize as pride. "Good," she said simply. "Try again." He did, and the second one was better than the first. Shen mastered knots faster than anyone. His quiet or patient nature was perfect for the careful work of loops and tucks and pulls. By the end of the second week, he could tie 7 different knots from memory, including one that Hannah had shown him only once. But Kes was the true surprise. The smallest cub, the one who had struggled the most at the beginning, turned out to have a gift for pattern work. Her claws were more flexible than the others, not yet fully hardened into adult form. She could manipulate the strands with a delicacy that left Hannah genuinely amazed. On the 12th day, Kes presented Hannah with a completed piece. A woven band made from 3 different materials, twisted together in a pattern that formed a series of interlocking diamonds. Hannah stared at it for a long time. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands, examining the work from every angle. "Did you make this?" she asked. Kes nodded, her ears pressed flat against her skull in what Hannah now recognized as nervous anticipation. "It is beautiful," Hannah said. "It is the most beautiful thing I have seen since I came here." Kes made a sound that was pure joy. The problem started on the 15th day. Hannah was teaching the cubs a new technique, a complex weave that required 4 strands working in opposite directions. The cubs were focused, their attention completely absorbed by the work. None of them heard the footsteps in the corridor until it was too late. A massive figure appeared in the doorway. It was a Verathan warrior, fully adult, with scars across his snout that spoke of many battles. He stared into the room with an expression that Hannah could not read. His eyes moved from Hannah to the cubs to the scattered materials on the desk. Then he spoke, his voice deep and cold. "What is this?" The cubs scrambled to their feet. Their postures shifted instantly, becoming smaller, more submissive. They kept their eyes down and their ears flat. Hannah stood slowly, She kept her voice calm. They have been visiting me. I have been teaching them. Teaching them what? The warrior stepped into the room. He was enormous, nearly 9 feet tall, with claws that looked like they could cut through steel. You are human. What could you possibly teach them? Hannah did not answer with words. Instead, she picked up one of the completed braids from her desk and held it out. The warrior looked at it. His eyes narrowed. He reached out and took it, turning it over in his massive hands. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the warrior dropped the braid on the floor and turned to the cubs. You will come with me. Now. The cubs obeyed instantly. They filed out of the room without looking back, their heads down and their tails dragging behind them. Hannah wanted to call out, wanted to say something, but she knew that would only make things worse. The warrior paused at the door. He looked back at Hannah with something that might have been contempt or might have been curiosity. Then he was gone. Hannah sat alone in her empty room, surrounded by materials that would never be used. 3 days passed. The cubs did not come. Hannah continued her work, but her heart was not in it. She kept looking at the doorway, hoping to see small shapes creeping toward her. She kept listening for the click of claws on stone. The pile of materials on her desk remained untouched. The half-finished projects gathered dust. On the 4th day, Commander Voss contacted her with bad news. There have been complaints, he said, his face grim on the holographic display. The warrior who found you with the cubs is named Garrick. He has reported your actions to the Outpost Council. Hannah felt her stomach drop. What kind of complaints? He is claiming that you have been corrupting the young, teaching them inappropriate skills, undermining their proper development. Voss paused. There will be a hearing. You will be expected to explain yourself. When? Tomorrow? Hannah spent the night preparing. She gathered examples of the cubs' work. She wrote out explanations of what she had been teaching and why. She practiced her arguments until she could deliver them without hesitation. But she knew, deep down, that none of it might matter. The Verithan valued tradition above almost everything else. And what she had been doing was not traditional. The hearing was held in the main council chamber, a vast room carved from black stone. 12 Verithan elders sat in a curved row, their eyes fixed on Hannah as she entered. The warrior Garrick stood to one side, his arms crossed over his chest. And in the back of the room, barely visible in the shadows, Hannah saw 3 small figures. The cubs had come. An elder spoke, her voice like dry leaves rustling. Human, you are accused of improper contact with our young. What do you say? Hannah stepped forward. She kept her voice steady. I say that I have done nothing harmful. I have simply shared knowledge. Knowledge that our young do not need, Garrick said. Knowledge that will make them weak. Warriors do not braid. Warriors do not weave. Warriors fight. Perhaps, Hannah said, but these young ones chose to learn. They came to me. They brought me materials. They asked in their own way to be taught. I did not force them. I did not trick them. I simply showed them what I know. The elders conferred among themselves in low voices. Hannah could not hear what they were saying, but she could see the doubt on their faces. Then a new voice spoke from the doorway. I would hear more of this teaching. Everyone turned. A massive Verithan female stood at the entrance to the chamber. Her scales were darker than most, with a pattern of lighter marks across her face. She wore the ceremonial marks of a high commander. Garrick dropped his head immediately. High Commander Rashka, I did not know you were on the outpost. I arrived this morning. Rashka walked into the room, her steps slow and deliberate. Her eyes moved to Hannah, studying her with an intensity that made Hannah want to step back. My daughter is one of the cubs who has been visiting you. I wish to understand what you have been teaching her. Hannah realized with a start that this was Kess's mother. I have been teaching her to braid, Hannah said, to weave, to create things with her hands. Rashka's expression did not change. Show me. It was not a request. It was a command. Hannah took a deep breath. She picked up a strip of leather from the pile she had brought, and she began to work. The room was completely silent as her fingers moved. The elders watched. Garrick watched. The cubs in the shadows watched, and Rashka watched most intently of all. When Hannah finished, she held up a simple braid. It was nothing special, just a demonstration of basic technique. But she offered it to Rashka with steady hands. The High Commander took it. She examined it carefully, running her claws along its length. Then she looked at Hannah with eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "Teach me," Rashka said. Hannah blinked. "What?" "I said teach me. If my daughter finds value in this, I would understand why." Hannah looked at the elders, who seemed just as surprised as she was. She looked at Garrick, whose face had gone blank with shock. She looked at the cubs in the shadows, and she saw Kess's ears lift with hope. "All right," Hannah said. "I will teach you." And she did. The council chamber had never seen anything like it. High Commander Rashka, veteran of 3 territorial wars, holder of 17 ceremonial scars, sat on the floor with her legs crossed and a strip of leather in her massive claws. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. Her tail twitched with frustration every time the strands slipped from her grip. Hannah sat across from her, patient and calm. She had been teaching for 3 hours now, and Rashka had destroyed 11 pieces of material in failed attempts. But the High Commander refused to give up. "The strands keep sliding," Rashka said, her voice a low growl. "My claws are not made for this." "Neither were theirs at first," Hannah said, nodding toward the 3 cubs who watched from the corner. "But they learned. You can learn too." Rashka looked at her daughter. Kess was sitting very still, her eyes wide, clearly unable to believe what she was seeing. Her mother, the fierce warrior, was struggling with something that Kess herself had mastered weeks ago. "Show me again," Rashka said. It was not quite a request, but it was closer than anything she had said before. Hannah demonstrated the motion once more, her fingers moving slowly so every step could be seen. "Hold the first strand here, cross the second over it. Then the third goes under, over, under, over, under. The pattern is always the same." Rashka tried again. This time, the strands stayed in place. She completed one full sequence, then another, then a third. The braid was uneven, barely holding together, but it was recognizable. The High Commander stared at it for a long moment. Then she made a sound that Hannah had never heard from a Verithan before. It was soft, almost gentle. "I made this," Rashka said. "With my own hands, I made this thing." "Yes," Hannah said. "You did." The elders watching from their seats exchanged glances. Garrick, still standing at the side of the room, looked like he had swallowed something unpleasant. But no one spoke. No one dared interrupt. Rashka looked up at Hannah. "In my life, I have killed many enemies. I have won many battles. I have earned my place through blood and strength." She held up the crude braid. "But I have never created anything. Not once. Everything I have, I took from others." Hannah did not know what to say. She waited. "My daughter came home speaking of patterns and shapes and things she had made," Rashka continued. "I did not understand. I thought you were filling her head with weakness, with softness, with things that would make her vulnerable." "And now?" Hannah asked quietly. Rashka's eyes moved to Kess. The little female was pressed against the wall, her body tense, waiting for her mother's judgment. "Now I think I was wrong," Rashka said. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. The elders shifted in their seats. Even Garrick's expression changed, though Hannah could not tell to what. Rashka stood. She was enormous, towering over Hannah, blocking out the light from the chamber's high windows. But when she spoke, her voice was not threatening. "I will not stop my daughter from learning," she said, "and I will not let others stop her either." She looked at the elders, her gaze sharp and challenging. "Is this acceptable?" The eldest of the council members, a female with gray-white scales and milky eyes, spoke slowly. "High Commander, the traditions are clear. Cubs of the warrior caste train for combat. They do not engage in the work of other castes. The traditions also say that each Verithan must find their own path to strength. Rashka replied. I have watched my daughter work. There is strength in what she does. It is different from my strength, but it is real. She held up the braid she had made, the poor, uneven thing that was barely holding together. I, Rashka, High Commander of the Southern Territory, state before this council that I see value in this work. I state that it does not weaken our young but teaches them something new. And I state that the human Hannah Cole has my protection in this matter. The chamber fell silent. Hannah realized she was holding her breath. The eldest council member looked at her colleagues. They spoke among themselves in low voices, their words too quiet for Hannah to hear. Finally, the elder turned back to Rashka. The council will allow this to continue, she said. For now. But we will watch. And if we see any sign that this work weakens our young, we will end it. Rashka dipped her head. That is fair, she turned to Hannah. It seems you have won, human, at least for today. Hannah let out her breath. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Rashka's eyes glittered. I expect you to continue teaching my daughter, and I expect her to excel. Hannah looked at Kess. The little female's ears were standing straight up, her whole body vibrating with joy. Behind her, Torek and Shen were grinning in the Verithan way, their lips pulled back to show the gaps between their teeth. I will do my best, Hannah said. The days that followed were the busiest of Hannah's life. Word spread quickly through the outpost. The High Commander herself had learned from the human. The High Commander herself had supported this strange new practice. Suddenly, Hannah found herself with more students than she could handle. Cubs came from every part of the outpost. Some were from warrior families, their parents cautiously allowing them to try this new thing. Others were from lower castes, drawn by the possibility of learning something usually forbidden to them. All of them wanted to know what Hannah could teach. She set up a schedule. Morning sessions for beginners, afternoon sessions for those who had already learned the basics. She recruited Torek, Kess, and Shen as assistants, letting them teach the simpler techniques while she focused on the more complex work. The pile of materials on her desk grew into a mountain. Strips of leather, lengths of wire, scraps of fabric, and stranger things. Woven plant fibers, dried animal sinew, even thin sheets of metal that could be cut into strips and braided together. And the things they made grew more complex too. Torek developed a technique for weaving leather so tightly that it became almost as strong as metal. He made straps and bands that could hold heavy loads, containers that could carry water without leaking, covers that could protect wounds better than anything Hannah had brought from Earth. Shen became the master of knots. He created new designs that no one had ever seen before, knots that could be tied with one hand, knots that tightened under pressure, knots that released with a single pull. Other cubs came to him with problems, and he would sit quietly for a while, thinking, and then show them exactly what they needed. And Kess became an artist. Her woven pieces were beautiful in ways that Hannah could not fully explain. She used color and pattern and texture to create things that served no practical purpose but which everyone wanted to look at. She made decorations for walls, bands for arms and legs, even tiny sculptures that she gave as gifts to her favorite students. Rashka visited often. She would stand in the doorway watching, her expression unreadable. Sometimes she would ask Hannah to show her something new. Sometimes she would simply observe. One evening, after the other students had left, Rashka approached Hannah with a question. Why did you share this with us? Hannah thought carefully before answering. Because I saw something in your children that reminded me of myself. When I was young, I was curious about everything. I wanted to learn everything. But there were always rules about what I was allowed to study, what I was allowed to do. And someone broke those rules for you? My grandmother. Hannah smiled at the memory. She taught me to braid when I was 5 years old. She said that everyone should know how to make something with their hands, that it connects us to who we are. Rashka was silent for a moment. Then she reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out something small and shiny. It was a woven band, made from strips of copper wire twisted together in an intricate pattern. Kess made this for me, Rashka said. She gave it to me this morning. Hannah looked at the band. The work was excellent, even by Kess's high standards. The pattern was complex, beautiful, clearly the result of many hours of careful effort. "It is wonderful," Hannah said. "Yes." Rashka looked at the band for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised Hannah more than anything that had come before. She slipped the band onto her arm. "I will wear this," Rashka said, "so that everyone knows what my daughter can do, so that everyone sees what she has created." Hannah felt tears prick at her eyes. "She will be so happy." "Perhaps." Rashka's expression softened just for a moment. "But more importantly, she will know that her mother is proud of her. And that is worth more than any braid or band or weaving could ever be." The High Commander left without another word, the copper band glinting on her arm as she walked into the night. Hannah sat alone in her room, surrounded by the tools of her teaching. And for the first time since she had arrived on Kareth Prime, she felt like she was truly home. 5 years had passed since Hannah Cole first stepped off the transport ship on Kareth Prime. The outpost had changed in ways she could never have predicted. The Eastern Medical Wing, once her lonely home, had been expanded to include 3 new buildings. One was a full hospital, staffed by both human and Verithan doctors. Another was a cultural exchange center, where species from across the Galactic Union came to learn about Verithan society. The third was the workshop. It had started small, just a single room where Hannah taught her growing number of students. But as the years passed and the demand increased, it had grown into something much larger. Now it occupied an entire building, with separate areas for different types of work. Leather, fiber, metal, and materials that had been invented specifically for this new art. Hannah stood at the entrance, watching the activity inside. Dozens of Verithan worked at long tables, their claws moving with practiced skill over their materials. Some were young, barely older than cubs. Others were adults, warriors and workers, and even a few elders who had decided it was never too late to learn something new. At the center of it all, directing the work, was Kess. She was not a cub anymore. She had grown into a young adult, tall and strong, with her mother's sharp eyes and her father's patient nature. The certification marks on her scales showed that she had passed every test required for mastery of the textile arts. She was the first Verithan in history to hold such a rank. Hannah watched her former student move through the workshop, stopping to offer advice here, to correct a technique there, to praise a particularly good piece of work. Kess was a natural teacher, better in many ways than Hannah herself. She had a gift for seeing what each student needed and providing exactly that. "She has grown into something remarkable," a voice said beside her. Hannah turned to find Rashka standing there. The High Commander had aged in the past 5 years, her scales showing the first hints of gray, her movements a little slower than they had once been. But the copper band still glittered on her arm, the one that Kess had made for her so long ago. "She has," Hannah agreed. "I am very proud of her." "As am I." Rashka's gaze followed her daughter across the workshop. "When you first came here, I thought you were a curiosity, a small, soft creature with strange habits. I did not understand why the Union had sent you. And now?" Rashka was quiet for a moment. "Now I think the Union understood something that we did not. They knew that strength comes in many forms, and they sent someone who could show us a form we had never seen before." Inside the workshop, a young cub was struggling with a basic braid. His claws kept slipping, and his tail lashed with frustration. Kess knelt beside him, her voice soft and encouraging. She took his hands in hers and guided them through the motions. Over and under, over and under. Hannah remembered doing the same thing for Kess 5 years ago, in a small room with a pile of leather strips and 3 curious cubs. "I have news," Rashka said. "The council has approved the expansion." Hannah's heart lifted. They agreed? They did. Starting next season, workshops will open in 12 more cities across the continent. The techniques your students developed will be taught to thousands. It was more than Hannah had dared to hope for. When she had first proposed the expansion, many on the council had resisted. They worried about moving too fast, about changing too much. They warned that traditions were being abandoned. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. The cubs who learned to braid and weave did not become weak. They became more focused, more patient, more creative. They found new ways to solve problems. They developed skills that made them valuable in ways that pure combat training never could. And they were happy. That was the thing Hannah noticed most of all. The students who came to the workshop were happier than those who did not. They had something to create, something to show for their efforts, something to give to others. There is something else, Rashka said. Kes has been accepted to the Cultural Institute on Earth. She leaves next month. Hannah turned sharply. She is going to Earth? She applied without telling me. There was pride in Rashka's voice, but also something else. Something that might have been sadness. She wants to learn more. She wants to see what other species create, how they work, what she can bring back to teach others. Hannah looked at Kes across the workshop. The young Verithan had finished helping the struggling cub, and now she was examining a piece of work that one of the adults had completed. Her expression was focused, serious, the same look she had worn as a curious cub peering around the doorway of Hannah's room. She will do well, Hannah said softly. I know. Rashka placed a massive hand on Hannah's shoulder. It was a gesture that would have terrified her 5 years ago. Now it felt like what it was, a touch between friends. But she will miss you, and she asked me to bring you to see her before she leaves. They walked into the workshop together. Kes looked up at their approach, and her face broke into the Verithan expression of joy that Hannah had come to know so well. Teacher, Kes said. Her standard Galactic was perfect now, with only the faintest trace of accent. I am glad you came. Your mother told me the news. Hannah reached up and touched Kes's arm, a gesture that had become their way of greeting. I am so proud of you. I would not be going if not for you. Kes reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out something small. I made this for you, so you will not forget me while I am gone. She held out a woven band. It was made from Verithan hide, synthetic cord, and copper wire, braided together in a pattern of impossible complexity. The colors shifted and flowed, forming shapes that seemed to move even when the band was still. Hannah took it with trembling hands. Kes, this is beautiful. It is my best work, Kes said. I wanted you to have it. Hannah looked at the band for a long moment. Then she gathered her hair in her hands, twisted it into a knot, and used the band to hold it in place. How do I look? She asked. Kes's ears lifted. Rashka made a sound that might have been a laugh. Around them, the other students had stopped their work to watch. You look like you belong here, Kes said. Hannah smiled. That is because I do. She looked around the workshop, at the students and teachers, at the materials and tools, at the things that were being created all around her. This had all started because she had tied her hair back on a humid afternoon, and 3 curious cubs had decided it was the most wondrous thing they had ever seen. Now it was something more. It was a movement, a change, a new way of thinking about what it meant to be strong. It was spreading across the planet, and soon it would spread beyond, carried by students like Kes to worlds that Hannah would never see. Outside the window, the twin suns of Kareth Prime were setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere in the city below, a new class of cubs was about to begin their first lesson. They would struggle with the strands. They would fail many times before they succeeded. They would grow frustrated and want to give up. But they would keep trying, because they had seen what was possible. Because they knew that creation was not weakness, that soft hands could do mighty things, that sometimes the smallest action could change everything. Hannah watched the sunset and felt the weight of the band in her hair. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her to braid so many years ago. She thought about the path that had led her here, to this place, to these people, to this moment. Thank you, she whispered, though she was not sure who she was thanking. Kes heard her. For what? Hannah turned to look at her former student, now her colleague, now her friend. She reached out and touched the copper band on Rashka's arm, the band that Kes had made so long ago. For seeing something worth learning in a simple thing, Hannah said. For bringing me gifts when you did not know what I wanted. For trusting me when you had no reason to. Kes's eyes softened. You gave us something we did not know we needed. How could we not trust you? They stood together in the fading light, teacher and student, human and Verithan, watching the world they had helped create take shape around them. And Hannah knew, with a certainty that went deeper than words, that this was only the beginning. There would be more students, more workshops, more worlds reached by this simple idea that everyone deserved the chance to make something beautiful. And it had all started because 3 predator cubs saw her tie her hair and decided it was magic worth learning. The end.